From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Revenants of the European Theatre. Glasgow Ghosts. Perhaps the most famous theatre ghost in Scotland is that of the Old Theatre Royal in Glasgow. There have been 3 theatres in Glasgow called Theatre Royal. The first and most celebrated was located in Dunlop Street. Built in 1782, it remained in use, apart from a short interval from 1805 to 1829. A theatre in Queen Street took over the name until it was burned down in 1863. After the destruction of the Dunlop Street Theatre, the name was transferred to an existing theatre in Calcadon Street, which, after 2 fires and subsequent restoration, became the headquarters of Scottish Television, whose employees have met a resident ghost from time to time. It is considered unlucky to talk about the ghost, so STV employees are very reticent. However, the ghost of the Theatre Royal, it can be said, is a spirit with poltergeist tendencies. It moves small objects and replaces them elsewhere. Before it was burned down, the Dunlop Street Theatre was considered the location of an animal haunting. Ross McIntosh was a popular matinee idol of the time in Glasgow, and one morning he entered the theatre and met a large yellow-colored dog on the main staircase. He threw it a piece of candy from the bag he had in his pocket. Taking no notice of the candy, the dog walked past McIntosh and descended the stairs leading to the foyer. Next day, in precisely the same place, the actor again saw the dog. Once more he threw the dog a piece of candy, and as before the dog padded past without paying it or him any attention. Thinking the actions very undog-like, McIntosh turned around to look at the animal, but it had vanished. Very puzzled by this, for it was not possible for the dog to have reached the bottom of the stairs in the time the actor had looked away, McIntosh resolved to look for the dog the next day. He did so, meeting the dog in exactly the same spot. This time he threw it a piece of aniseed fudge. As the dog ignored the sweetmeat, McIntosh tried to prod the dog with his cane. The silver-topped cane passed right through the beast, which at once faded into nothingness, leaving Ross McIntosh feeling weak at the knees. Apparently the dog, which had died some 10 years before, had belonged to a former manager of the theatre. Dublin Ghosts. During the 19th century in Ireland, it became popular with managers of public houses and hotels to form parts of their premises into small concert rooms. Such an entrepreneur, Dan Lowry, opened a house in Dublin in December 1879 called the Star of Erin. This was not a legitimate theatre and only produced music hall entertainments. It closed on February 27, 1897, and opened again some 8 months later as the Empire Palace Theatre. This playhouse was to become the celebrated Olympia Theatre. For the most part, the hauntings at the Olympia take the form of noises. Lena Morgan, stage designer for Telefis Irish Television 2, has said, "I've heard many curious tappings and bangings at the Olympia, and doors being shaken when they were very heavily chained. I have heard windows rattle outside the room, upstairs dressing room number 9, where I was sitting, and when I came out, I realized that there was no window. The noises were heard by another theater designer, Alpha O'Reilly." A former resident stage manager, Jeremy Swan, also attested to the manifestations of a poltergeist, which threw makeup and clothes around dressing room number 9 during a pantomime run. Apparently, added Swan, there had been knocking at the door every night and nobody there. Swan once saw a glowing yellow light from some unaccountable source in the corridor outside the haunted dressing room. When the light passed through a doorway, the door slammed shut. Whispering noises accompanied the appearance of the knee-level light. Tom Connor, an electrician at the theater, also heard mysterious footsteps coming down from his dressing room. He made a search but could find no one. Later, he felt the theater rostrum tilt as if levitated by unseen hands. A seance was conducted at the theater in the 1960s, and the medium Sybil Leek, who had no prior knowledge of the haunting, noted, "I had a strong impression about the year 1916 as I stood there on the stage, and that the spirit which inhabited the theater was of a very unruly man. It didn't belong to the theater, yet was trapped and wanted to get out." It transpired that the theater was the center of some violent disturbances during the Easter Uprising of 1916. A civilian and IRA suspect was shot on the premises by mistake. Because of the trauma surrounding his death, his spirit is deemed trapped. The Irish actor Michael Wackmore attests that he has heard phantom footsteps at the Gate Theatre, Dublin, but no one knows who. A manifestation in Wales. The Monnow Bridge at Monmouth, Wales, has a fortified gatehouse built in 1296 for the purpose of levying toll on merchandise taken over the bridge. During the Civil War, the bridge was held alternately by the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. Today, the bridge spanning the River Monnow between Monmouth and Usk is a curiosity, but no more curious tales connected with it than the one associated with the Richard Charles Travelling Theatre Company. During the 1880s, this company used to tour the Welsh valleys with the usual Victorian tearjerkers. Two actors in particular were with this company, Basil Hart and Harry Maynard. The company had struck some particularly bad times, and the governor, Richard Charles, had put everyone on half wages and had sacked a number of others. Harry Maynard was to be the next to go. The traveling actors had come to Monmouth and had camped in the afternoon near Monnow Bridge. In the evening, Basil and Harry were standing on the bridge contemplating whether it would be more advantageous to commit suicide than to carry on. They talked for an hour or so, and Basil excused himself, for he was on in the first play that night. Harry was not on that night. Instead, he had to scene shift, but would not be needed until the second play. The two friends parted at 6 p.m. At 7:30, the theater opened in a local hall, and Basil did well in the first play that night, getting good laughs from the audience seated on hard wooden benches. All the time, he could see Harry at the back of the hall watching him. Harry was still staring fixedly throughout the three scenes of the first play, which came to a climax at 8:15 p.m. But Harry did not appear when he was due to shift scenery for the next play. He could be found nowhere. When he had finished acting for the day, Basil searched the hall and back at the lodgings for Harry. He even went down to the bridge to look for his friend, but could not find him. Next morning, the newspaper headline said, "Itinerant actor pulled out of river." At 6:15 last night, an itinerant actor, Harry William Maynard, was pulled out of the River Monnow by the water bailiffs. It is thought that he had committed suicide. "That can't be right," Basil said to the other shocked members of the company. "I saw Harry at the back of the hall for the start of the first play at 7:30, and again during the third scene at 8:15. "You must have seen his ghost then," offered one of the cast. "Yes," replied Basil huskily. "Undoubtedly it was his ghost." The Dutch Rooftop Theatre. As far as is known by the Institute voor Theater of Utrecht, there are no haunted theatres extant in modern Holland. During the 17th century, however, it was fashionable for wealthy merchants to commission plays to be performed for their guests at parties or special occasions. One couple who made a living out of writing and acting in these plays were Betty and Petrus van Hoofenstael, who converted one of their attic rooms in their Amsterdam apartment into a small, intimate theater. The Van Hoofenstals slept in bunks at one end of the theater, and it was here that they began to experience strange happenings. Besides hearing unaccountable sounds such as footsteps and voice whispering in the theater room at all hours of the night, they would wake up suddenly to find that their bed sheets and blankets had been taken off and thrown some distance away. Further, on arriving home after playing elsewhere, they would hear someone strumming a guitar. When they entered their theater, fully expecting to encounter the instrumentalist, they found the room empty and the stringed instrument of the theater band neatly stacked as always. One evening, when Petrus was alone writing a play, he heard the sound of a woman laughing just behind him. Thinking that Bet had come home, he turned around to speak to her, but no one was there. Perhaps the most curious thing of all was that together they experienced a dual dream. They both dreamed on the same night that they encountered a tall blonde seamstress in their theater. Bet and Petrus knew she was a seamstress by her dress, and she was just leaving the theater with an antique yard measure in her hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" they both remembered saying. "Don't worry," the woman had replied with a curtsy. "The young man will have the best shroud I can make." With this the girl had wished them good day and vanished. At this point the Van Hoofenstals awoke. Struck by the oddness of having the same dream, Petrus Van Hoofenstal carefully jotted down the facts of the occurrence, with the hope that he might use them in a play. This dream, however, occurred again and again, until one day the actor and actress came home from the market to find the girl they had seen in their dreams hurrying away from the door leading to their apartment. As they climbed the stairs, they heard the strumming of the guitar. Again the room was empty. They told their landlady of their dream and of the unaccountable music. She recounted to them that some years before the apartment had been rented to a young Italian musician, whose girlfriend was a seamstress who lived nearby. One day the girl had come to a friend's apartment to find him in bed with another girl. The seamstress had killed them both as they slept. The murderess had then drowned herself in the neighboring canal. Thereafter her spirit had been seen in the apartment and the street outside. Eventually the ghostly disturbances in the Rooftop theater got on the Van Hoofenstals' nerves so much that they did not renew their lease. The amorous Danish ghost. Ludwig Holberg, Adam Gottlob Oehlenschläger, and Hans Christian Andersen were well known in Denmark for the ghosts in their plays. Few people know, however, of the ghosts at the Royal Theatre at Copenhagen, perhaps because the haunting in total did not last more than 2 years. Anna Christiansen was an actress at the theatre during 1874 to 1876. One day she was sitting at the window of her dressing room when she saw a young man walk down the street. He was dressed as a thespian and wore a red flower in his lapel. Catching sight of her at the window, he blew her a kiss and disappeared into the theatre below. The young woman heard footsteps on the stairs, and she turned away from the window as they stopped outside her room. A few moments later the door of her rooms opened, and the young man took a step inside. She was about to let him know in no uncertain terms that she wanted none of the cheeky advances he had displayed in the street, when the giggles of some actresses were heard down the hall, and the young man withdrew and closed the door. Next day, as she went to her dressing room an hour or so after the midday meal to prepare for a matinee, she heard footsteps behind her in the corridor leading from the stage door. Anna turned and saw the young man with the red boutonniere a few paces behind her. He leered amorously at her, and she was just about to give him a tongue-lashing in her native country dialect when someone further down the corridor spoke to her. She turned to reply to the stage manager, who had come up to her, and on reaching her room saw that the amorous young man had gone. She didn't see him for several days, but one morning on entering her dressing room she saw the young man sitting in her armchair. Indignantly she told him to get out and leave her alone. He rose and gathering his cape about him left, but not before he had impudently brushed his elbow against her breast. Anna went straight to the manager's office in a fury and complained vehemently about the young actor, describing him in detail. "There is no one here of that description," said the manager. "You must have made a mistake, Anna." "But—" The manager hesitated and motioned for the young Danish actress to be seated. "What I have to tell you is strictly confidential, you understand." Anna nodded. 2 or 3 years ago, the young actor you describe was employed here. He was a lecher and wouldn't leave the girls alone. I dismissed him, and when I was paying him the wages the theatre owed to him, he spat in my face and said he would haunt whoever took over his dressing room. You, Anna, are the third girl to use that dressing room who has seen him. Seen his ghost, that is, for he was killed by a jealous husband 6 months later." The manager moved Anna to a different dressing room, but the hauntings continued. In time the room was not given out to actors and actresses again. It was used as a storeroom, and thereafter the hauntings stopped. The Polish Matchbox Miracle. Each year, early in December, a competition of a unique nature is held in the center of Krakow, Poland. The contest is to select the best Sauspas, the traditional Polish puppet theaters in which miracle plays are performed. For hundreds of years, the model theaters of Krakow have given annual performances of miracle plays. It was unemployed bricklayers who made Sauskas what they are today, for the performances enabled them to earn a few coins during the long winter evenings. Later, the Sauskas have become a cult, but the materials for the model theaters are still simple: paper, tinfoil, and matchboxes being the most popular media. Sauskas date back to the 13th century, when Polish monasteries first presented religious miracle plays in honor of the Christmas holy days. Later these plays were taken over by university students. The Sauskas competition of 1944, however, was to be the most remarkable in living memory. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, and the making of Sauskas was forbidden by the Nazis, who feared every activity that might keep alive national pride and inflame resistance. However, the traditional folk craft was practiced in secret, and Sauskas competitions continued. There was an old superstition in Poland that if the country was ever invaded, the end of the oppressor's rule would be in sight of 7 Saska makers sat round a Sauskas theater in holy seance. As a mark of the truth of the oppressor's downfall, if the prize-winning Sauskas of that year was placed on a pedestal within a circle made by the 7 sitters, each holding hands to form an unbroken circle, the figures in the miracle plays would come to life. At least, that is what the old folks said. This kind of prognostication, it appears, had happened first when a monastic Sauskas had forecasted the defeat of the Mongols who overran the country in 1241. In the 17th century, the Sauskas of the monk Sigismund had forecast the defeat of the invading Russians, Swedes, Transylvanians, and Cossacks by the Polish hero Czarnecki. Subsequent invasions of Poland have been forecast by Sauskas up to the early 19th century. In 1944, a group of priests sat in holy seance around the Sauskas in Warsaw. To their amazement and no little fear, the small figures of the miniature theater began to be moved by unseen hands to enact a miracle play. Would the hated Germans be swept out of Poland as the theater had indicated? Radom, Warsaw, Lutz, and Krakow were all taken by the victorious armies of Zhukov and Konev within a year. Although the Sauskas art flourishes today in modern Poland, divination was strictly forbidden by the country's Russian overlords. Ghost at the Comédie Française. The Comédie Française, or Théâtre Français, is a national theater of France that was founded in 1680 at the command of Louis XIV. Of all French theaters, this is the one with the best claim to be haunted, although none of the famous names of the Comédie, like Talma, Adrien Lecouvreur, Rachel, and Monet Sully, are deemed to walk here in spirit form. No, the ghost of the Comédie Française came from the outside. Mademoiselle Hippolyte Clarion was a noted French actress of her day, and for a time was the mistress of a wealthy Breton, Monsieur de S. The Breton was a morose man, and his main topic of conversation was death and a supposed life beyond the grave. As his fortunes dwindled through mismanagement, he began to borrow from the actress whom he jealously adored. This led to an embarrassing dependence of the Breton on his mistress, which led her to seeking an excuse to discontinue their association. Monsieur de S bombarded the actress with impassioned pleas to return to him. She refused, even when he was reported to be seriously ill. On the night of his death, Mademoiselle Clarion was entertaining friends to supper, when just after 11 o'clock the company was startled to hear a loud cry of heartbreaking sadness outside in the street. The actress fainted with shock. So disturbed was she that friends stayed with her during the night. The next morning the actress received the news that Monsieur de S had died shortly after 11 on the preceding evening. On many succeeding nights thereafter the cry was heard, and always when 11 o'clock had just struck. Neither friends nor police could account for the curious cry, which was now also heard outside Mademoiselle Clarion's dressing-room window at the Comédie Française. The cries were heard nightly outside the actress's house for 3 months after Monsieur de S died, then they faded away. They were, however, easily summoned by the presence of the actress at the Comédie. Each night she appeared the cry was heard by the audience, the staff, and the actors. During the year of the French Dauphin's marriage to the Infanta Marie Theresa, King Louis XV ordered that a play in which Mademoiselle Clarion was playing should be performed at the Royal Private Theatre at Versailles. Strangely, the cry of the ghost of Monsieur de S was heard by Mademoiselle Clarion and her actress friend, Madame Grandois, at their lodgings at the Avenue de Saint Claude, and during the performance of the play at Versailles. On the actress's return to Paris, the cry outside her house was replaced by a mysterious musket shot, which continued for a further 3 months. Then this noise was replaced by the sound of hand claps and later of music. A lovely voice singing a plaintive melody began to follow Mademoiselle Clarion, both in the street and at the Comédie. 2½ years after the first despairing cry, the noise phenomena stopped completely. The period of time the noises had lasted had some significance, it seems, as was revealed long afterward. The reason was given to Mademoiselle Clarion by an old lady who had attended Monsieur de S during his fatal illness. Monsieur de S had spoken of Mademoiselle Clarion on his deathbed, swearing that he would haunt her wherever she went, for a period as long as they had known each other. Up to the time of his death, they had known each other for 2½ years. Nikita Khrushchev's Russian Ghost. Ghost stories from the USSR are few and far between, mainly because the Soviet Union discourages the popular discussion of psychic phenomena. During the 1950s, however, the story circulated among foreign diplomats that Nikita Khrushchev, then first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, had seen a ghost at the famous Moscow Art Theater. Khrushchev was attending a special presentation. During the first intermission, he went to the lavatory, and on his way back to his seat, he encountered a bearded man. The man was dressed in a campaign uniform of the late 1890s, and on his arm was a vivacious young woman. Khrushchev was shaken by what he had seen. His companions at the theater even asked if he had been taken ill, for he knew who the uniformed man was, and could guess who the woman might be. The Soviet leader was not himself for many days afterwards. He confided in a family friend, "Vladimir, I saw the man as clearly as I see you, a man I know to be dead. Immediately I got the security people to close the theater exits and entrances, but they found no traces of the man and woman. They just vanished. The occurrence rocked me to the very foundations of my beliefs," continued Khrushchev. "Next day I got my secretary to look into the state archives. I refreshed my memory with portraits of the man. Yes, it was definitely he. And as to the woman, a small vivacious girl with a supple body, a full bosom and arched neck, dark curls and merry eyes. Yes, it was definitely Mathilde Schiska of the Imperial Ballet. Mathilde had been a royal mistress who had married Grand Duke Andrei at Cannes in 1921 and had later settled in Paris. At the time Khrushchev claimed to have seen her ghost, she was alive and well. Khrushchev was adamant that he had not made a mistake. The man he had seen at the theater was the arch-fiend of communist mythology, Nicholas Romanov, last Tsar of all the Russias, who had been murdered with his family by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Cairo's New York evil spirit. Count Louis Hammond, died October of 1936, was a world-famous palmist and seer. During his career as a psychic, he told the fortunes of most of the personalities of the period, including that of the great actress Sarah Bernhardt. One of his clients was the American actor James K. Hackett, who won fame for his performance at Macbeth in Paris, June 6 of 1921. During the late 1890s, Count Louis, who was known professionally as Cairo, first met Hackett and told his fortune while they were both sitting in a railway carriage in Grand Central Station, New York. During the interview, Hammond told Hackett of the evil influences he believed haunted the Lyceum Theatre at New York City. He was never very specific, but on the occasions he had visited the theatre he found it dominated by a spirit which gave dubious gift to its favorites. What he was suggesting was that if the ghost liked you, then it would help your performance, but the success achieved would be a disadvantage in the long run. The ghost, it appeared, was that of a man who used to live in the building that had formerly occupied the theatre site. Hackett ignored Hammond's advice to steer clear of the Lyceum. In a letter to Hammond on April 11, 1914, Hackett wrote, "When I was 26 I played the prisoner of Zenda in the Lyceum Theatre, New York City, and the very importance of the success has artistically strangled me ever since." A prophesizing ghost of Rome. In 1900, Hammond was in Rome and had interviewed with, among others, Pope Leo XIII and King Umberto of Italy. During this visit, the seer went on the trail of an Italian theatre phantom, which he averred forecast the king's impending death. Can a person be sentenced to death by some premonitory warning and, despite every conceivable effort to avoid its fulfillment, finally die on the day and hour foreshadowed? Count Hammond once asked this question at a public lecture, and certainly believed such an event to be a reality. While in Paris, Hammond met the actor Luigi Spartaggi, who was playing there at the time, and the actor told him a story which strengthened the belief. One evening in the first week of January of 1900, the actor had returned to his dressing room to find that someone had scrawled the name Bresci on his mirror. Spartaggi thought it was some kind of joke. He certainly didn't know anyone called Bresci. Again, after a performance a week later, as Spartaggi went back to his dressing room to change, he saw a woman dressed in motley coming out of his room. He called out to ask what she wanted, but she disappeared into the gloom at the end of the corridor. This time the word Monza had appeared on the mirror. Spartaggi, of course, knew of the industrial and cathedral town of Monza, in Lombardy, but why should its name be written on his mirror with his grease paint? Next evening was the last straw. Spartaggi saw the woman coming out of his dressing room again. What message would she leave this time? For Spartaggi was convinced that it was the woman who was doing the writing. The actor ran down the corridor after the woman, but once again she had disappeared. On the mirror was written in Italian, "Remember," and the figures 18781879. By this time Spartaggi thought it had gone beyond a joke. He went to the theatre manager's office, but the manager was out. The next day Spartaggi went again to the manager's office, and finding him there, told of the mystery writing on the mirror. The manager turned up a dusty file and showed Spartaggi that similar occurrences had happened in 1878. At that time a French actress called Wilde had occupied the dressing room. She too had seen a mysterious woman coming out of the room several times. This time one word had been scrawled, namely Victor. Days later, Victor Emmanuel II, King of Sardinia and of Italy, had died. Research had shown that years before even Wilde's time, a woman answering the description of the figure the two actors had seen had played that particular theatre in Rome. Between acts, she had entertained the audience with mind-reading and fortune-telling. People thought that this woman's ghost had forecast the death of Victor Emmanuel II. Yet what of the writing on Spartaggi's mirror? Bresci, Monza, and the figures. What did it mean? Spartaggi puzzled it out, but could come to no logical conclusion. Then it dawned on him. If Victor was Victor Emmanuel, then the new writing must have something to do with King Umberto, the present Italian monarch. The 56-year-old king seemed well enough, still a ghostly warning was a warning. Spartaggi would go to the police in the morning. They would probably laugh at him, but at least his conscience would be clear. On his way to the theater next morning, Spartaggi bought a paper. The headlines told of the Italian king's assassination. A cold sweat of fear broke out on Spartaggi's brow. Ranieri Carlo Umberto I of Italy had been assassinated July 29th of 1900 by the anarchist G. Bresci at Monza. This time an assassin had been successful, whereas the other attempts on the king's life in 1878 and 1879, the figures on the dressing room mirror, had failed. The murdered German actress. Baden-Baden, the German-spawned land of Baden-Württemberg in the Ouse Valley, lies 43 miles west of Stuttgart. The mineral springs there have been known from the time of the Romans, but the great days of the spa were in the 19th century, when it was one of the most fashionable towns in Europe. During one season in 1887, a group of German businessmen and their wives were watering here. One evening, while they were all sitting in the lounge of a prominent Baden-Baden hotel, the conversation turned to ghosts. Most of the company expressed mild skepticism, except Herr T. A. Hoffmann and Herr Adolf Gluck. Herr Hoffmann dismissed the whole subject as utter rubbish, while Herr Gluck berated him for his closed mind. "There's something to this hotel," said Herr Gluck. "A famous medium, you know of her, Hoffmann, Frau Else Hensen. Now shall we engage her for a séance here at the hotel to put your agnosticism to the test?" Hoffmann agreed. Duly at the end of the week, Frau Hensen arrived at the Baden-Baden Hotel and expressed delight at being asked to give a private sitting. Herr Hoffmann, however, was not taking the risk of being duped. He insisted on holding the séance in his suite. "Frau Hensen," he said, "I do not wish to be made to look foolish. I believe that mediums play all kinds of optical and conjuring tricks on credulous people. To make sure that I am satisfied concerning the test, I ask you to agree to certain conditions." Frau Hensen said that she would naturally have to hear the conditions first before she agreed. "Very well," replied Herr Hoffmann. "First, I would require you to go with my wife into our bedroom, remove your clothes, put on a dressing gown, return here, where you must allow me to tie you to a chair and seal your secured hands with sealing wax bearing my own seal. Then I would place your feet in a tub, half filled with plaster of Paris. When the plaster sets, I shall be satisfied that you cannot move or play tricks." Frau Hensen thought for a moment, then said, "I agree to your conditions for the sake of my spiritualistic beliefs, but you must realize that I cannot guarantee results." In about half an hour, Frau Hensen was tied in the oak chair, the knots were sealed with Hoffmann's signet ring marked on wax, and her feet set in plaster of Paris above the ankles. The company of 5 witnesses took their place, and Herr Hoffmann locked the door to the suite, fastened the window, and sat down opposite the medium. For some 10 minutes nothing happened. All that could be heard was the medium's breathing deeply. Herr Hoffmann lay back in his chair smoking a cigar with a smile of satisfaction on his face. Suddenly they all saw something grow from a pinhead of light floating in the air above the medium's left shoulder. Then clearly and distinctly there appeared the form of a young woman. The head, face, and body, as far as the waist, became materialized. Moving forward in its semi-solid state, the materialization came within a few inches of a now rather disturbed Hoffmann. "Mein Herr," the female phantom said in a heavy South German accent, "do you remember me?" "No," replied Hoffmann, "I certainly do not." "That grieves me, sir, although it is several years ago now. You came to my apartment in Berlin. Do you remember your Mitzi from the Imperial Theatre Company? You ought to." Hoffmann shifted uneasily in the chair and looked askance at his wife. Against his will, the former skeptic answered, "Yes, I remember now. But this must be some trick." "No, no, it is no trick," replied the phantom actress. "Do you remember sketching me nude on my bed? We did not know at the time that my lover was behind the door curtains. He heard me say that I would come to your hotel the next day. There was a poignant pause. Everyone held his breath. Hoffman broke the silence. Look here, Gluck. Must this go on? You occasioned it, my friend, replied Gluck. The ghost girl continued. Ah, mein Herr, did you wonder why I did not come? Now I can tell you. I am free from all mortal silence now. I was stabbed in the belly and had my throat cut by my lover. He killed me for love of me and jealousy of you. The apparition and the voice died away. Herr Hoffman wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, clearly shaken. This convinces me, he said, fumbling for his cigar case. I had forgotten that episode in Berlin. Certainly none of my friends and business acquaintances knew of it. Frau Henson certainly could not have known of it. It must be years ago, maybe 10. I saw the actress at the Imperial and thought what a wonderful picture she would make, nude. He eyed his wife nervously. I made a sketch of her at her apartment, and she said she would come to my hotel to let me finish the picture. When she didn't turn up, I assumed she had another appointment. His hand trembled as he lighted another cigar. I still have that sketch among my papers. Herr Hoffman never argued again about psychic matters. His wife was clearly not amused. Several international returnees. No haunted theaters are known in Sweden, and the only play the Svenska Institute at Stockholm knows of containing a ghost is The Phantom Chariot by Selma Lagerlöf. This does not mean, however, that there are no supernatural stories connected with the theater in Sweden. One story concerns an actress who died in 1913 at Stockholm while performing at the theater there. Of French extraction, the actress was a devout Roman Catholic and had required in her will that certain masses be said for her soul. Her will, which was held by her local priests, was mislaid at the time of her death. Here is a quote from a Swedish paper of the time. After the death of Marie Josephine Leclerc, the clergy of the Stockholm Catholic Confraternity were troubled every night for about a year and a half by noises in the presbytery. Then the wall of Madame Leclerc was found requesting 10 masses to be said for her soul. This had not been done. Immediately the masses were said and the noises ceased. The priests associated the noises with the angry ghost of the dead actress. Likewise, haunted theaters are unknown in Belgium, although there is a sporadic use of ghosts in the works of such as Tone Brulin, Herwig Hensen, Claude Spack, and George Sim. There is this story, however, from the memoirs of Philippe Clemenceau concerning the ghosts of Marie Pestanchik, who wished to repay a debt. In February 1899, I took over my duties of advocate. On my second week in my new office, I was visited by a woman called Claudine Fresco, who for more than a month had been in the utmost anxiety to see a lawyer. This woman stated that an actress lately dead, Marie Pestanchik, slightly known to Fresco, they lived in the same block, had appeared to her during the night for several nights, urging her to go to a lawyer. This lawyer, the spectre said, would collect from her dead husband's estate fund the sum of 800 francs to pay a debt which she, Pestanchik, owed. I made inquiries and found that certain bills were outstanding in the actress's estate. I withdrew a sum of money and paid these off, including the 800 francs stated. Subsequently, Fresco was troubled no more. Psychic Puzzles. Avon Theater, Utica, New York. Some 50 years ago, it seems, a mystery woman ran down the center aisle of the Avon Theater and shot the pipe organist dead. Gossip of the time had it that the organist was cheating on his wife, and she took the traditional way out of the situation. From that time to the theater's demolition in 1947, the building was deemed haunted. Night porters at the Avon testified that the organ would rise from the pit at midnight and play music without the assistance of human hands. The theater auditorium would be filled with this sinister music until someone entered. Then it stopped. During the last few years of its existence, the theater had difficulty employing staff, so well known did the psychic happenings become. Piccadilly Theater, West End, London. During the early 1970s, actress Sarah Miles, who was playing Mary Queen of Scots in her husband's play Vivat Vivat Regina, was troubled by an unaccountable force. Miss Miles had a dazzling array of costumes to wear for the play, and for one scene she had to quick change to a dark red riding habit. The whole change had to be completed in around 50 seconds. Miss Miles' dresser, Hersey Pigot, would unbutton the garment in advance before she left the theater at night and hang it up that way in the wardrobe in Sarah Miles' dressing room. On one particular night, when the quick change came, Pigot discovered to her great annoyance that the buttons were done up. That night the change took many vital seconds longer. No one in the theater knew anything about it. The same thing happened the following night. Suspicion fell on the theater cleaners, but they all denied touching the costume. That night, Hersey Pigot and Sarah Miles placed the unbuttoned dress in the wardrobe, locked it and the dressing room, and took the key away with them. No one could have entered the room without breaking in. There was no sign of a break-in, but the dress was found the next day to be buttoned. Clearly something supernatural had taken place. The difficulties continued for a week and then ended. There has been no such trouble since. Actress sees husband's death in plane crash. American actress Jane Withers avers that she foresaw her husband's death in a plane crash. Call it clairvoyance, intuition, sixth sense, or what you will, she says. Things have happened to me in the theater that cannot be explained any other way. The former child star says that she had a recurring dream and intuitive e-flashes when in the theater dressing rooms about her husband's dying in a small private plane. She only agreed to marry him when he promised to sell 2 airplanes he owned and flew. I always cautioned him not to fly in small planes, says Miss Withers. One day, in a rush to get home from a business trip, he decided to take a private plane. It crashed and he was killed, just as I had foreseen several times. Sometimes theater atmospheres set off her psychic awareness like a force within me, a nagging feeling. It's accompanied sometimes by a tremendous illumination that almost blinds me. Dylan Thomas at the Bush. The Welsh playwright Dylan Morley Thomas, who passed away in 1953, is said to haunt the Bush Theatre, London. The Bush is a small French theatre that was formerly a BBC rehearsal room and is a part of the upper rooms of the Shepherd's Bush Hotel. One materialization of Thomas took place in the presence of author-actor Michael Mondell and half a dozen colleagues. After a late-night rehearsal, they locked up and remembered that they had been observed by a man who had stood silently at the rear of the theater. They went back to let him out, but found no one there. The man was subsequently described as plump, podgy-faced, about 40, and with dark curly hair, a description that fitted Dylan Thomas perfectly. Thomas had used the Shepherd's Bush Hotel for drinking bouts after working at the BBC TV studios around the corner. Helpful ghosts. Mae West has long been a devotee of spiritualism, to such an extent that she began to be troubled by strange voices in the night. Finally, I had to quit fooling around with the forces. They kept me awake. By and large, however, the ghosts around the octogenarian actress are helpful. She says she once heard an entire script in 56 seconds, the length of the time it took to play a chorus on the piano. She dictated what she had heard from the ghost voices in 45 minutes to her producer and director. The script resulted in one of her best films, Every Day's a Holiday. The actress reported on various occasions hearing spirit voices in a number of theaters, and once she reported a whole circle of ghosts hands over her head. City Varieties, Leeds. As recently as the 1950s, this famous music hall theater has been said to have been haunted by the ghost of a woman who some people believe is the wraith of the well-loved artist Florrie Ford. This old theater saw the great days of music halls in the north of England, and at one time artists performed on a sawdust flooring. Florrie's wraith, as the ghost is called, has been seen on the stage and in the orchestra pit. Does a famous dead film star guide her? Hollywood actress Leslie McRae claims that she is guided by the ghost of Clark Gables. Leslie belongs to a Hawaiian cult whose members meditate. Through this, Miss McKay says she can communicate with Gable's ghost. He inspires me and tells me every move to make. John Brown's voice. Another actor who is inspired by a voice from the grave is British actor Bill Dysart. This time the ghostly emanation is that of John Brown, the faithful Highland servant of Queen Victoria. Dysart says that when he was acting in the play King Edward VII, he spoke the part of John Brown, with a voice copied from one beyond the grave. This ghost voice of the real John Brown was tape recorded by a friend of Dysart at a seance held by the celebrated spiritualistic medium Leslie Flint. It is a very hoarse voice and very much in the back of the throat. It is interesting to note that there is speculation that in life Brown was a medium and had contacted Victoria's dead husband, Prince Consort Albert. American actor Incarnate Spirit. Veteran film star Glenn Ford believed that his soul, spirit, or what you will, had lived before, as a cavalryman called Lanvaux in 17th century France. Ford said that he was taken by ghostly hands during hypnotic trips to see his past. In vivid dreams his ghost guides him, show him how Lanvaux was an officer in the elite Versailles cavalry. Strangely enough, said Ford, where Lanvaux was pierced by a sword, I have a birthmark that hurts at certain times. Ford also says that throughout his acting life, he has been bothered by the ghost of a Scottish piano teacher called Charles Stewart, who was born in 1774 and died of tuberculosis in 1812. Although Ford is not a pianist, this ghost once assisted him to play, expertly, difficult works by Beethoven and Mozart, when Ford was required to do this for a script. Psychic Prime Minister of Mirth. The late George Robey, nicknamed Prime Minister of Mirth, delighted music hall audiences for over 60 years. Few realized that the comedian was psychic and something of a faith healer. Successful theater producer Peter Coates recalls an example of Robey's ready talent. During 1915, when Robey was starring in The Bing Boys, he was visited by Dr. Nettle Collier to say goodbye before he went off to France. Everywhere he went, Robey took with him a collection of charms. He gave one of them to Collier with a comment: I will that nothing more shall happen to you throughout the war, that then you will lose the middle finger of your left hand. Goodbye and good luck. Dr. Collier thought no more of what Robey had said, but in 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he got in the way of a shell. The smoke cleared, he found his left hand was smarting and spurting blood, and his middle finger had been blown off. George Robey was said to haunt the Hippodrome Theatre at Manchester, but there are no modern instances of psychic phenomena connected with him. Conrad Veidt returns. The spirit of the German character actor Conrad Veidt is said to have returned recently to someone who worked with him. This occurred to Mrs. Josephine Jobson of Bishop Auckland, County Durham, with the help of a medium, Betty Dawson of Gateshead. From Betty Dawson's description, Mrs. Jobson recognized the actor with whom she had worked at Denham Studios in Buckinghamshire in 1938. The ghost of Veidt appeared at the seance dressed in the uniform of a U-boat commander and wearing a monocle. His favorite role, Conrad Veidt, died in 1943. Two theatricals still walk. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. The dramatist and poet was born at Dublin in 1854. Today he is remembered mainly as the witty author of Lady Windermere's Fan, An Ideal Husband, and his masterpiece The Importance of Being Earnest. Wilde died in 1900 in obscurity and poverty, resulting from his prosecution and conviction for homosexual practices. His ghost has been long associated with two London theatres, the Haymarket and the St. James, where his plays were often presented. In 1923, ghosts were seen at these theatres, and spirit messages which purported to come from Oscar Wilde were received by actors and actresses working there. The ghostly messages were deemed genuine by the London-based Society for Psychic Research. A book was later published on the messages called Ghost Epigrams of Oscar Wilde. During December of 1923, two young actors and an actress held a private séance at the St. James, and during this, it is said, automatic writing, a ghostly hand holding a pen, occurred in which the words "Pity Oscar Wilde" appeared. This was reminiscent of automatic writing that had been produced under séance by members of the SPR, except that the latter had asked the question, "If a spirit is present, will you give your name?" and had received an extended answer, "I am Oscar Wilde. I have come back to let the world know that I am not dead. What you call being dead is the most boring thing in life." Oscar Wilde's phantom pen was about to write more. "You know that we are a sort of amphibian who has a foot in either world, but belongs properly to neither. We live in the twilight of existence. In eternal twilight I move, but I know that in the world there is day and night, seed time and harvest, and red sunset must follow the apple green dawn. Already the May is creeping like a white mist over the lane and hedgegrove, and year after year the hawthorn bears blood-red fruit after the white death of its May. Now the mere memory of the beauty of the world is an exquisite pain. I was one of those for whom the physical world existed. I worshipped at the shrine of things seen. There was not a blood stripe on a tulip, or a curve on a shell, or a tone of the sea, but had for me its meaning and mystery, and its appeal to the imagination. Others might sip the pale lees of the cup of thought, but for me the red wine of life. Pity Oscar Wilde." To further the investigations, the SPR encouraged an additional séance to be held, in which one of the officers was present. A series of questions were asked concerning Wilde's family life. None of those present knew the answers to the questions, but later investigation proved the answers to be correct. During this séance, the SPR official asked for further evidence of the ghost's identity. The response came, "Do you doubt my identity? I am not surprised, and sometimes I doubt it myself. I have always admired the Society for Psychic Research. They are the most magnificent doubters in the world. They are never happy until they have explained away the spectre, and one suspects a genuine ghost would make them exquisitely uncomfortable. I have sometimes thought of founding a society of celestial doubters, which might be a sort of SPR among the dead. No one who left the earth under 60 would be admitted, and we would call ourselves the Society of Supernatural Shades. One of our objects might well be to investigate the reality of a psychic research worker. Fortunately, there are no facts here. On earth we could scarcely escape them. There are, after all, I could detach myself from my body. Here I have no body to leave off. So one of our most interesting occupations is impossible. It is not by any means agreeable to be a mere mind without a body." "Will you tell me something of your prison life?" was the next question from the SPR representative. The ghost's answer was, "My circuit of the world's pain would not have been complete without the supreme misery, for to me it was supreme. I who worshipped beauty was robbed not only of the chance of beholding her face, but I was cast in on myself." People who knew Wilde attended other séances, and theatrical experts assessed the messages of Wilde's ghost and accredited them with the mortal Wilde's style and wit. Most were convinced that Wilde's shade had returned to earth. Spirit of a film star. British actor Leslie Howard, who died in 1943, became an actor in 1917. After successes in the United States and Great Britain, he became increasingly engaged in films and was internationally famous for his roles in The Scarlet Pimpernel and Gone with the Wind. He was killed when the plane he was traveling in from Madrid was shot down by German aircraft. Some people believe that his ghost returns from time to time. Actress Molly Weir is one. In July 1943, she says she saw his specter just after he was killed. She remembers going to bed on that particular night and winding up the special arid blind. Sometime during the night, she awoke suddenly. I looked toward the curtains, moving slightly in the breeze, she told friends. Without the slightest fear, I saw a man's figure pause on the ledge a second and swing into the room. He was smoking, and Molly Weir smelled the tobacco fumes. She recognized him as Leslie Howard. He came toward the bed, sat down on the edge, and gazed into the moonlight with the dreamy abstraction I'd observed so many times in his films. For 5 minutes he sat there. With a sigh, he stood up, moved towards the window, swung his legs over the ledge, and vanished. Next morning, Molly Weir heard that the actor had been killed. Ghostly actor at St. Andrews. Playwright A.B. Patterson was undoubtedly the driving force in the establishment of a repertory company in the fife town of St. Andrews, Scotland. Back in 1933, he and others took the lead in converting an old cowhouse into the lively By Theatre. Now the small intimate theatre has been transformed into a new theatre which was opened in 1970. The theatre today is located between Abbey Walk and one of the medieval land rigs. It is here in the medieval garden at the main entrance to the theatre where the ghostly actor patrols. This area has been a busy thoroughfare for centuries, so the wraith may date back to the days when the nearby ruined cathedral was prospering. The ghost of the Byre Theatre precinct was last seen in 1973 by an American couple who were in St. Andrews for a golfing holiday. I interviewed them in the lounge of the Scores Hotel. Mrs. Herman Josephson spoke first. Herman and I had just emerged from a little passageway from South Street when we saw him. He was standing near the portico of the little theatre. As I remember, he was dressed in tight trousers, white shirt with a sort of frilly front, and leather boots. He had one foot on the steps, almost as if he were reading the theatre program. I took a few photographs, added Mrs. Josephson, and I saw him clearly through the viewfinder. Yes, but as we moved nearer, said Mrs. Josephson, I could see right through him. I felt quite sick, so we went to sit down on a bench nearby. Mr. Josephson patted his wife's hand. When we looked again, the man had gone. What clinched it for us was that when we had the film developed, the man was not on the print. Yet I remember seeing him clearly in the viewfinder. Ghostly warning. One morning, American TV star Lucille Ball awoke feeling disturbed and depressed. It was almost as if a cloak of psychic matter had enveloped her. As she lay in bed, she had the strong urge to contact her friend Helen. It was as if the psychic aura were cautioning her of some hidden danger that might affect her friend Helen and Helen's husband, Jimmy Thurston. Helen confirmed, however, that her husband was all right. At the time, he was out on some errands. The fearful sensation would not leave Lucille Ball alone, however. This feeling of terror still gripped me, she said. I'd never felt anything like it before. As she drove to work that morning, she sensed that a terrible road accident was about to take place. This feeling of psychic doom impressed itself upon her miles before she passed the spot where police and fire vehicles had set up warning lights to redirect traffic. On arrival at the studio, she sensed uneasiness and phoned Helen again. Everything's fine, Lucy, came the reply. Jimmy's a little late getting back. Are you sure he's okay? Lucy persisted. As far as I know. By now, Lucille Ball knew that something had happened. She sat numbed in her dressing room. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. In a very strained voice, Helen said, Lucy, it's Jimmy. But how in God's world did you know? Jimmy Thurston had been killed, and Lucille Ball had been warned of the event by some kind of ghostly precognition. Secret and forbidden. During the 18th century in Europe, it was fashionable for men about town to become members of a theatre of eros. These were private theatres where lewd plays were enacted in which members would take part in body roistering with the actresses. In France, the theaters were called petites maisons, and it was said that a former Bishop of Orleans had had such a theater in the cellars of his private palace. Certainly Prince Philip of Lyons had a private theater performing erotic plays in Montmartre in 1749. Head and shoulders above others, however, was as a patron of erotic theaters was the Duc de Henin. Plays were written for the Duke by an ex-monk called Deslys de Sales, who is still thought to walk in a house in one of the nobleman's properties in the Rue de Saint Pierre, Paris. One bookseller reported that his slumbers were regularly interrupted by ghostly footsteps on the stairs. When he went to investigate, no one was there. One night he spent an hour watching the staircase as the ghostly feet tramped up them, but no materialization were to be seen. Later, the bookseller discovered an old volume that stated that his house had once been used by the Duc de Henin as a petite maison, and that the phantom footsteps of past customers were often heard going up the stairs. From time to time, the wraith of de Sales has been seen too. Dame Sybil Thorndyke's phantom partners. When the world-famous Old Vic Theatre in London, transformed from a derelict theatre by the indomitable Lillian Bayliss, was closed down in 1963, Dame Sybil Thorndyke commented that she was convinced that the actress's ghost was still in the theatre. She had felt its presence many times. Dame Sybil, however, has a more personal ghost, the shade of her dead husband, the late Sir Louis Casson. I am always conscious of his presence, she says. The actress shared ESP gifts with her husband. A drugstore clerk called Stevens once went to a play in which Dame Sybil was acting with her playwright brother Russell Thorndyke. Stevens distinctly saw ghosts on stage when the Thorndykes were acting a scene. Later, Stevens described the ghost to Sybil, who instantly recognized it as her father, who had been an honorary canon of Rochester. Keenan Wynn's story. A warning voice has been with me most of my life, said American actor Keenan Wynn. He learned not to ignore the warnings of the ghostly voice that echoed in his brain. Who the ghostly voice belonged to on earth, he did not know, but it had been helping him since he was 16. It first warned him not to ride his motorcycle on a particular day many years ago. I thought it was silly, so I did anyway, and I crashed. Since then, I've raced boats and cars and soloed in planes, and I've heard it many times. I'm always better off when I listen to it. Many times I've avoided bad accidents by hearkening to that ghost voice. The Contented Monk. The district of St. Bartholomew stretches from London's Smithfield Market to the Old Bailey. Here in the 12th century was an Augustinian priory which was sponsored by a monk courtier of Henry I's entourage with the strange name of Rahere. The priory was despoiled by the order of Henry VIII in the 16th century, but parts of the fabric were incorporated into the present church of St. Bartholomew the Great at Smithfield. The church houses the tomb of Rahere and his ghost. It is a well-known fact among ghost hunters that the spectre of Rahere was seen by a former rector of St. Bartholomew's, the Reverend F.G. Sandwith. In fact, the clergyman saw the spectre twice. Few, however, know of the encounter made by some actors in 1932 who were staging a nativity play near the Lady Chapel. 4 of them during the final rehearsal experienced a sense of calmness and peace that accompanies the ghost to such an extent that they looked forward towards the iron gates of the chapel in Union. There they saw the figure of a monk standing near the altar steps. His shadowy form faded away in the soft lights of the altar candles. Voice from Beyond. While playing at the Coliseum Theatre at London in Madame Butterfly, actor-singer David Hughes told reporters that he's influenced by the ghost voice of a dead conductor. Often Hughes has heard the gruff voice of the late Sir John Barbirolli, the former conductor of the Howth Orchestra. giving him encouraging messages and advice. Sir Charles' Psychic Voyage. Sir Charles Henry Hawtrey, who passed away in 1923, the actor, manager, and playwright, first appeared on stage in 1881, and he became famous for producing a series of light comedies. He was interested in psychic matters and once told of a strange psychic trip that happened to him while he was playing at the Playhouse Theatre in 1920. He was not feeling too well at the time and remembered being lifted by unseen hands to a plane of astral consciousness. Of the trip, he left this account. I was being carried swiftly through space into the upper air, on and on and on, only conscious of the most delightful feelings of exhilaration. Such exhilaration as one has even imagined. After a while, I found myself standing alone upon a gleaming pavement of black marble, a raised step in front of me, and overhead an arc of the deepest azure blue. As I stood there, I felt distinctly that I was in the presence of people who had died long before, and that their ghost hands had brought me here. In my hands I found materialized several golden balls, and these I knew I had to place upon the steps in front of me. The balls were different sizes and were difficult to arrange, as they kept rolling away in all directions, so I knelt down to get at them better. At last I did it, and those golden balls lay shining with marvelous brilliancy upon the black marble, and as I looked at them, still kneeling, I said, "I am sorry not to have done it better." And a ghost voice answered me, "Then go back and try again." Once more I was conscious of being borne through the air, returning to earth again, and filled with the same indescribable sense of exhilaration. Somerset Maugham commented that Sir Charles had told the story many times to friends, and that the incident had a profound effect on him. He believed that he had died, and that for a short time had become a ghost himself. On his arrival in the world beyond, he found that his life on earth had not officially ended, so that he had to return, as it happened, for 3 years only.